it up. And the whole logic was that they wanted to rush the marriage amendment, get it through a libertarian or majoritarian or a democratic way to bring a moral law. They were in a rush to sort of on of the religious right. They've really gotten into a fit and a fury lately. And for several years now, I've been saying that when I've gone along to some of their meetings, they say very openly and belligerently that there's no such thing as separation of church and state. And you know, they're passing out the term because that term doesn't exist, but the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law establishing religion nor prevent the free exercise thereof, that is a description of a wall of separation, which Thomas Jefferson, in putting forward the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, which is exactly the same wording, he said it erected a wall of separation between church and state, and it was always understood that way. So in essence, they're putting themselves up against the Constitution because they've adopted, many of them, another model that this is a Christian nation structurally, which it never was. You could study history and you know it wasn't, and nor was it by design. But, you know, facts be damned, they have this mythical history of America which ignores a lot of the warts and other streams of history and sort of focuses on the pilgrims and you know, the religionists, even in the two Great Awakenings, which were wonderful, but, you know, they look at that and nothing much else and think this is supposed to be Christian and the laws should support that. And I believe since 9/11, with the growing antagonism to Islam, their vision of America becomes more and more exclusive. Because you can see with President Obama, they do not want to grant more wide-ranging or a clearer practice of faith for Muslims and other non-Christian religions. Not at all. They're well on record they want to restrict that. So what they're wanting is entitlement for their version of Christianity. And there are many statements that have come out on that. When the president was first elected, remember he put in as Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And in the first news cycle of his appointment, he publicly said he didn't believe in the separation of church and state. So this should be just red flag for anyone that believes in religious liberty. And a number of others in the president's cabinet have said as much. The president hasn't acted on it directly yet, but it was also very troubling with this religious naive individual. Before the election, the president went to, I think it was the Red Mass, but anyhow, met with all of the Catholic leaders, and he was photographed between Cardinal Dolan, head of the U.S. the U.S. bishops, Catholic bishops, and another cardinal, and he was photographed between them, and he said he would do everything he could to support the prerogatives of the Roman Catholic Church. Maybe that was just a political statement, although we've discovered that for better or worse, this president, which is actually a good thing, he tries to do what he says he's going to do. He fulfills his campaign promises. And I'm old enough to remember when John F. Kennedy ran for president, and he was quite a good president on most parameters. But in the election, the US was just frantic. The idea that a Roman Catholic might be elected in a country which allowed religious freedom, but culturally was a Protestant nation. And with the agenda of Rome, which you and I know as Adventists, luckily, Kennedy gave some good speeches and acted independently, and he said he believed in an America where the president doesn't take his biddings from a prelate or a pope or whatever. And to me, it's very significant that in recent years, I think it was this last presidential election cycle, the Catholic bishops said that they made a huge mistake with President Kennedy in not requiring him to obey the dictates of the Catholic Church, and they would not make that mistake twice. So I wouldn't take lightly that this president is very cooperative with the political agenda of Rome. We can't object to people being Catholics or Muslim or whatever. Religious freedom means you must allow everybody to make their spiritual choices or against spirituality. Fine, it's open go. But when you're talking about governance, it's very dangerous. I think in a democratic system like this, with the history of Rome remember, it's a hybrid, a church that says it's a state and a state that says it's a church, and it has a history of political meddling. It's very dangerous to allow Rome this sort of an influence. So we've got the double-headed threat of radical, politically active Protestants who are seeking political power to re-Christianize, remoralize this country. We have Rome that is feeling its oats, and 2 cycles ago, presidential candidate Santorum, a dedicated Roman Catholic, very hardcore, nice person, but very hardcore believing Catholic. He said, and got a lot of press on it, he says, Protestantism is absent in America today. So Rome clearly believes that Protestant America is back on its heels, doesn't know who and what it is, and the numbers bear it out. In Congress, Senate and the House of Representatives, and in the Supreme Court in particular, Catholics are the largest single group. Not more than all Protestants, although on the court they are. But, they've taken advantage, which is their right, but they've moved into a vacuum. So the influence of Rome, which is not just doctrinal, it's an agenda of control, is there. And the religious rightists in the Protestant faction are also wanting laws. I read articles where they have about 120 Supreme Court decisions of the past that they want to undo. And we'll see where we go. I personally don't believe that the Supreme Court is the problem. But if a Sunday law, say, were to be passed by Congress, I would think this present Supreme Court would rubber stamp it more likely than other courts. So in that sense, it's dangerous. But, we're in a very dynamic situation where the average person has forgotten the Constitution. They've forgotten the reason that the US was so insistent on all sorts of civil and religious liberties. We've turned our back, as you see more and more with this wall issue. We've turned our back on the world, which might be fine for self-protection, but it means the hardening of hearts on just human kindness and a sense of affinity for other human beings. It's a selfish spirit that's taking place. We feel vulnerable. We feel threatened since 9/11. And as always, they make the comment that there are no atheists in the foxholes. And I believe it's just sure as night follows day, that as the stresses that we're clearly facing, financial with the whole economy shaking, with the natural disasters, the external threats, the demographic challenges, the religious right is going to be pushing and pushing that we take some religious/legislative solution to all of this. So while none of us can know when a Sunday law will come, I think it's far more, not likely now, but it's a likely proposition with the present developments coming being advanced than ever before. And I'll end, before we have questions, and just throwing in what I mentioned this morning. I watch Rome, and I don't read everything. It's impossible to read all their documents, but I read all the major documents that come out of Rome. And I've discovered that not many Adventists are reading them, at least not in the administration. But there was a document that came out in 2015 called Laudato Si, Praise Be to Thee. Rome is issuing many documents, and they're all of different categories. There's papal encyclicals and pastoral letters, and they have about a dozen different categories. This was a major document that it says, as I alluded to this morning, that it's for the whole world, not just for one denomination, not just for Christians, everybody. And it's a very good exposition over about 120 pages of the ecological crisis the world is facing. And it says the world is dying, and for our survival as a species, we have to address this. So he makes the stakes pretty high. And while there are two levels of argument, there's a secular discussion and then a theological outline. The theological one is centered always, as it says, on rediscovering the rhythms God put in nature, exemplified by the Sabbath, the rest principle. It says not just for man, but for animals. Not just for animals, but for the whole of creation needs to honor this rest cycle of the Sabbath day. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious. And then in a document before that, his predecessor in 2008 issued a document called Caritas et Veritatis, Charity and Truth. And that was issued the year of the financial collapse in the whole world. It wasn't just the US. It was given to Obama as a new president, and he took it with him to the meeting of the G8, the Western economic powers. And it says there, addressing all of the problems of the world, it included ecological, financial, issues of national sovereignty, capital and labor, and so on. It said there that there is a need for a global authority to deal with these, a global authority with the power to act and to enforce. I mean, it might as well come straight out of Revelation or Great Controversy. They've shown their hand. And recently, in objecting to Trump, and the Pope and Trump don't get on too well, which could be a good thing. Remember, he called Trump, he said Trump is not a Christian, which is probably a truism, but a very rude statement from a global religious leader to make about the leader of another country. And to me, that's the same dynamic as in the old days of the Holy Roman Empire. You know, the Pope would declare a ruler he didn't like that he'd been excommunicate. That meant instantly that his subjects could rise up and overthrow him. That's a heavy thing to say you're not a Christian. But recently, the Pope was quoted in Europe as saying about the US, invisibly Trump, I think, he said, the sooner they come under global governance, the better. So whether there'll be global governance, I couldn't say. But that's where it's all heading, where a global entity will take control of the destiny of the world, and as part of that, mandate that people obey the seventh-day Sabbath on Sunday. As you'd expect, Rome's a Sunday church. So, you know, we're in an interesting dynamic situation. Religion is front and center. A lot of your fellow religionists and even a few Adventists see this president as a modern-day Cyrus. And goodness knows, Cyrus was not a Jew. You know, he was a pagan king that relieved Israel. So it can happen, but I think that's a very dangerous assumption with this man. You know, we wish the best on any US president. No person of faith should oppose even a Herod. Remember, the worst Jesus did on Herod says he's a fox, which he was, right? But there's nothing that Jesus said or did to undercut Herod's secular rule. But you know, we should be very careful where we're going at the moment in upholding a profane sort of a rule of thinking he's God's man. What I think is more pertinent to this, remember some deviant Adventists who'd become Davidians. Remember the standoff on Mount Carmel. Everybody that's perished in that confrontation with the ATF and other federal agencies was either an ex-Adventist or the child of an Adventist. And they'd fallen for the view that David Koresh, their leader, was a sort of a wicked savior, that his very character flaws it meant that God was going to work specially through him because he was a very needful leader. We shouldn't fall for that with this or any other president. If they do good things, you acknowledge it. If they do bad, you stand off as Christians and follow God instead. But to sort of put God's oil of anointing on the most pagan of pagan rulers just because they happen to do something to support your cause is a very dangerous endeavor. And yet that's where we are. And an awful lot of Adventists, when I travel around, totally enamored of the president, rather than praying as we should for all kings and rulers, wicked or otherwise. They're standing in the place of God in executing civil laws, but they have no authority over spiritual matters. Anyone got any questions or objections? What's troubling you about what's going on? Or if you've got questions on Sabbath accommodation, which is, of course, something our Religious Liberty Department is involved with. I sometimes, even as I say it, think I'm giving the impression that it's an unimportant part, but it's very important, especially for the person that's having a problem in the workplace. It's taking advantage of supportive laws to give us some relief. But religious liberty is a lot bigger than that, in my view. It's describing how we relate to any authority figures and after a time of trouble.
What I find in a lot of cases here, and this is me looking at a wide range of how people think, when we have a tendency to think that individuals are going to solve the problem for us,
Right.
the government system, whether it be progressive, we all of a sudden veer our allegiance to certain parties because we assume that that's going to fit our mode of thinking,
Right.
or our mode of how life should be. Yet our focus should be on Jesus Christ.
Right.
I really find that a lot of Adventists focus on political powers as their source of help.
I know, and that's not how we began, but we've drifted into that. You're right.
And then we argue over Facebook and everywhere else about issues about this and that. I'm like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
We're supposed to all be in unity together to work towards the common cause, and that's to preach the gospel of Christ, right?
Yeah.
So why are we so against each other?
Yeah. You're reminding me of something that I've had a burden on for a long time, but I used to speak on it during the year of the celebration of the Reformation. I've gone back a few times and I've read Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which most people don't read it, but I wish people did. Then they wouldn't fall as easy for the Roman Catholic explanations as to how misdirected it all was. But most of his points are on the question of authority. Who has authority? And he denied the Pope the authority. He doesn't have the authority to grant indulgences. He doesn't have the authority to forgive sins or whatever. He's interjected himself. And I really think we need to keep this in mind. That's why I read that section from John Knox. He was dealing with the authority of Mary Queen of Scots. And Ellen White makes it very plain that as we come to a crisis point in this country, there's going to be leaders and members standing up and saying that we have to obey the authorities, that they are the operating authority. They are not on such things. But we need to be careful because all through the ages, and it will happen again, people pluck these texts pretty easy, They wield not the sword in vain, obey the prince. Yes, in a general sense, but not when there's a moral question, a matter of religious loyalty. And so we shouldn't fall for that quick question of authority. And I don't know what they're recording. But the same thing's going on in our church. We have a huge dispute about authority between the General Conference and the North American Division. And there's an issue at play, but it's devolving to sort of rebellion, people following their own will and not accepting legitimate authority. In our case, our authority doesn't come from administrators, it comes from our church group in session, a General Conference in session. So when something's been settled that way, for then individual administrators to decide, I'll do what I want. I mean, that's the spirit of rebellion. And again, read John Milton's Paradise Lost. I've studied it, and most of the expositors fail to see what's going on. The main criticism they give on it is that Satan is a hero figure because he gives wonderfully heroic speeches. But I think I read enough, if you were listening, or if you could understand it, maybe it's a better word, that Satan didn't really accept God's authority. That was his big problem, and he was setting himself up. And yet what I read, he accepted that God was, the power of the universe, but he questioned it. I know better than him. I can challenge him. So we need to realize in these events, is the authority with the state on spiritual matters, or is it what God tells me? Don't accept authority lightly. And within the church, just because there's some administrator, say, who pushes something you personally like, look at why they're doing it. Maybe they're still acting disruptively. And it's worth remembering in Paul's writings, he tells a little bit about the Jerusalem Council and how they debated certain things, but when the council made a decision, it was abided by, even though people differed. And Paul himself, when he was, or was it Jesus, when he was, the high priest struck him, as I remember. He railed on him, and then they said, "This is the high priest." "Oh, yes, I'm sorry, You have to respect authority until it goes beyond its own limits of authority and asks you to do something that's against the superior authority of God. And I think in the conflict, that's what it will devolve to. And I do believe, I've always believed, in the United States, we're more vulnerable than many countries. People that lived in the Soviet Union or in Iraq, places like that, they had no question. They knew that the leaders or the dictator didn't really have any spiritual authority or right to ask them to do certain things. But in this country, we've always tended to equate the governance with at worst, it's benign. At best, it's sort of standing in for God. And when it asks us to do something, when this system asks us to do something opposed to God's will and our conscience, many people, I think, are just going to reflexly figure, well, it's for the best. This is a Christian society after all. I'll go along with it. And, that's going to be a great deception. Yeah.
I think from what I have studied and researched, I think how it's going to happen is you mentioned the Laudato Si, and that's of course,
Sorry, the loud what?
The Laudato Si, where the Pope calls for that we have to have a day for the environment and things.
Oh, yeah.
And that's kind of rooted in climate change.
Yeah.
So I really think how things are going to go is that if the government makes something, say for the sake of not just the country but the world, to save the climate, so we're going to put through a summit, and if anyone goes against that, they will not only be accused of going against the country, they will be accused
Enemy of mankind.
The destruction of the world.
Right.
Basically.
Charles has heard me say this many times before. This is a good time to tell the story, an incident that happened when Dr. Gratz and I went to Indonesia, where they had religious warfare. Thousands of people had been killed before we arrived, and it wasn't active violence when we arrived, but they were still under martial law, and all the destruction was evidence. Maybe a quarter of all structures burned and abandoned in fights between Christians and Muslims. This was in the Maluku province of Indonesia. And we met with the Minister of Religion, had a good talk. And, what do you say? Muslims and Christians were killing each other, even in our Adventist church. The bullet holes in the lectern and in the walls, and we found out that they'd had ceremonies dedicating the bullets and the guns, and they'd been shooting from the balcony at Muslim places. It was horrific. So we had a good talk with this Dr. Mara Sabesi was his name. And after quite a long time, it was in his home, very friendly, then he said, "I need your help on the most important question facing us here." I'm thinking, what's this going to be? They're in the middle of killing and violence and burning and murder and mayhem on every count. And he told us a story of how a year earlier a Christian evangelist had arisen in the community, preaching that Jesus was coming back. We were there in February, but in the November of the previous year. And he said tens of thousands of people sold their properties or gave them away or nearly gave them away and retreated with this evangelist to an outlying island to await the return of Christ. And he said he didn't come. And he said, now these people want their property back. He says, this is the biggest problem facing our community. Biggest problem. And I thought, this is exactly what you're talking about. As things really go bad and the stakes are super high, it's very easy, not even necessarily cynically done, when there's a disruptive element like this, in this case that was misguided Christians with setting dates, suddenly you're the problem. And that's what Ellen White says in Great Controversy, when she says that they'll say this is the temporal millennium. We've solved, or we're solving most of the problems, but you're an impediment. You won't go along with it. You're just a little people. Why do you think that you should object? You're now causing the problem. You become the focus of everything. And I really believe that it's an old dynamic, and it could easily and probably will be the way it will develop here. People don't like a group that are stones in the works, or a spanner or a wrench in the gears.
I came in a few minutes late, so I don't know if you touched on the Paris Accord at all. And what
The environmental. Well, I spoke about the Pope has clearly cast his hat into the ring, using the environment as the gathering call for all faiths. And more than that, he's appealing to governments for a concerted international action to save the planet. And part of that involves rediscovering the seventh-day Sabbath / Eucharistic Sunday. It's unambiguous. Read the document. You can find it online. It's Laudato, Laudato, Laudato Si. It's on the Vatican website, but if you just dial in Laudato Si, or even just dial in papal document on the environment, it will come up one way or another, a full downloadable document.
there seems to be two, I don't know if philosophical is the right word, not theological, but two ideas floating around within Adventism on what could bring about the National Sunday Law. Okay? And both of them are on extreme, one is an extreme right, the other is extreme left. And the one on the extreme right is the evangelical right-wing Republican Party, pushing for a Sunday law, just to have control of government and control the nation. And the other idea is on the extreme left, there's the progressives that are trying to save the planet and creating this false environmental issue, in the meltdown of all the ice,
You threw in the loaded false.
And so it's like there's extreme contradictory and conflicting views, and the majority of Adventists are actually, because it seems like a lot of Adventists have become so opposed to the extreme right, driven by fear of the right bringing in the Sunday law, that they swung completely over to the left.
Well, some. Overall, I think Anglo-Adventists are more attracted to the right-wing view. But on your point, I listen to all sorts of stuff out of Washington, where I live, obviously. And the Republicans are sort of flat earthers on environmental or global warming. But I think it's as much terminology. They don't like to admit the possibility that it might be man-made. And you can debate that till the cows come home. If it's spoken of as global climate change, it's in your face. Anybody that travels around the world knows that the world is in a period of unprecedented meteorological change. That's undeniable. And I just wish they wouldn't keep throwing in the idea that it's man-made. Even if it's not man-made, the efforts to cut emissions and so on still could be of some value. But I think it does unite the right wing and the left wing in that regard. The Liberals are more ecologically concerned. But if you read Ellen White, if you know a bit about history, 9 times out of 10 in history, it's the right-wing reactionary forces that bring in the more rough solution. I know people talk about some of these left-wing revolutionary groups and so on, but by and large, even in Latin America, where we've had a lot of experience of it, it's the right-wing death squads that are to be feared more than the ideologue who's in the jungle and might come in now and then and harass people in a village. Yeah.
It seems to me that the right-wing forces tend to be better organized and more focused, whereas the left-wing forces tend to be a bit more disjointed and more being
Right.
across.
And remember, left-wing, as Adventists and our religious liberty people describe it, are people that don't believe in religion. A lot of, they're liberal on faith too. And the Christian church from its very beginnings was largely ignored by secularists and liberalists. That's not a direct antagonistic approach. It's sort of like, we don't want to know about you, nonsense or whatever. But the right wing are the people that often have a view, like even within the church. I remember I had a big argument years ago with I won't name him because I'm glad he's forgotten, an old editor of the Signs of the, not old, but a long time ago, editor of the Signs. It should never have been there. And he wrote a column about the frogs and the toads. I forget which was which, but I think the toads were the right-wingers and the frogs were the left-wingers. And he was maligning the right-wingers under the guise of sort of frogs and toads. They're both sort of creepy amphibians. But I said to him, the left goes out to people that don't even care to be associated with. The right wing, they're back all the way into the corner. They're not somewhere else, they're here. It's a lot easier to see and to feel the effect of the right wingers because they're not somewhere else, they're within your group. But the left is a fringe just out to nowhere. And great controversy is very plain that it's largely the right-wing religious faction in this country that will bring in the Sunday law. But they will agitate the situation so when emergencies come of different types, the general public will clamour for the Sunday law. So it's not, while it's making its way in secret, or at least I wouldn't call it secret now, but it's not in your face. You can easily describe discussions that are going on and efforts to push Sunday law. When it appears, it will appear out of the blue and by popular acclaim. I don't see any reason to think other than that dynamic. That's exactly how it's working. But the right wing are just part of it. But their solutions are very unambiguously hardcore legislative. And, I've often tried to remind Adventists, there are 2 main factions in this regard in the religious right. One you know about because they've manifested themselves. It's called dominionism. And the dominionists have an interesting, rather harsh worldview. It's like God gave dominion over this to Adam, over this world. And they interpret that to mean it's our right as the favoured Christian nation in this case and people to plunder the earth, to extract all out of it and sort of to do and to order it at our whim rather than as you and I might think to be good custodians. And dominionists, of course, have a sort of a triumphalist view of this society and how the law relates to it. But they get their power and their legitimacy from a deeper philosophical movement within the right wing called Christian Reconstructionists. And I'm not sure they'll ever gain power in their own right, but they are very influential. Over the years, whenever I read a list of people that are in some White House confab talking to the president about Christian values and so on, always the leaders of the Christian Reconstructionists are there. Their main leader is Gary North. His father-in-law, Rushdoony, founded it. And only about a year ago, I heard one of their representatives on the media saying that they had rethought their position on homosexuality. They want an Old Testament economy to rule in this country, sort of a Christian Sharia law, and they'd previously said that it would be mandatory death for homosexuality. But he said, we've rethought that. As long as people keep quiet about it, we will not execute them. That's very charitable. But that's how they move with the time. But they're well on record to say that after a 6-month cooling off period when they gain power, there would be mandatory death for homosexuality, adultery, and Sabbath breaking. And they're in the chat room with the top political leaders. And again, it's a rather extreme view, but it percolates up, and it's arrived. I'm sure most of you have heard the dominionist viewpoint. That's pretty much mainstream in the right wing of Christianity.
Could you clarify the difference between Christian dominionism and Christian Reconstructionism?
Well, Christian dominionism is Reconstructionism light. That's the only difference. It's a more palatable, less rigorous application of Old Testament norms. But no, they're kissing cousins. That's my point. Christian Reconstructionists, it'll be a hard day when they could gain direct power. I mean, that's just unpalatable to even most Christians. But they're pushing. And in the last couple of years, the Reconstructionists have sponsored several missions to Africa where they've sent lecturers and so on to tutor some of these emergent African regimes. And in each case, almost before they've got off the plane from leaving Africa, they've passed, among other things, death penalty for gays. And it's been very embarrassing for them, but the line is sharp and bright. It's what they recommend. The way they get out of it, they say, well, it's another world, another economy that, they wouldn't necessarily be so willing to push that here, but they're I've read their stuff. I first found out about them years ago when I was editing Listen magazine. I used to go to the Christian Booksellers Association meeting where there were tens of thousands of printers and publishers and distributors of all sorts of, as they call it, their trade term is Jesus junk and holy hardware. Interesting gathering of all Christian distributors of mostly books, but other stuff. And there was always a booth from the Christian Reconstructionists, and I talked to them and I would read their material. And from then on, I watched them. And it's not just that I know about them, but once you know, you can find their influence quite common. And like I say, the easiest way to understand it, it's a Christian Sharia rule for this country, which would never pass now, don't get me wrong. It would be rejected out of hand now. But as the troubles and trials come upon us, and reflex Christianity and the desperate sort of, figuring God's got to bless this country again mentality takes on, I wouldn't put it past even this country to pass something pretty much along the lines that they're saying. Because none of us know the future, but just think of the future. I travel a lot in the US, and believe me, this country, as the Bible says, is getting old like a garment. Everywhere you go, we've just pillaged. Not as bad as places like China and even parts of the ex-Soviet Union or India, where industrialization is so bad that the fog hangs in the air. You can hardly breathe. Like in Japan or some places, you've got to pay for oxygen, I've seen the booths. You can get an oxygen mask and it's, so many dollars or yen for 5 minutes of oxygen. But that said, we're clearly stripping the thing. Like the latest things happening, most people don't much think about it. Fracking. Do you know what fracking is? Wells that go down miles into the ground have been dried up of oil, but to get what might still be residually in the crust, they're under pressure, forcing water with sand particles, pumping it in and breaking the bones of the earth. That's what it is, cracking the earth. And as the water forces in and breaks up the rock, the little sand particles then wedge it closed, and then the leakage creates a second flow of oil. Well, fracking has given us a second lease on life as an oil-producing country. If you go online, you'll find that the earthquakes are increasing exponentially. Hundreds of earthquakes in these areas where they were never known before. We're destroying the earth, and the Bible's very plain. God is coming to destroy those who destroy the earth. So we're planting the seeds of geological destruction with fracking. The sociological situation, it's nice here. Not in winter probably, but it's a nice place. But you go downtown New York or downtown Chicago, I'm sure there's places you and I wouldn't want. I mean, I've been to a lot of the places, but you don't want to go there. The corruption in our cities and rundown areas is everything like what you see in these paintings of Hogarth in London in the 1600s. You know, where there's class warfare and meltdown of sanitation and all the rest. It's not all sweetness and light. And I've been in meetings where the military guys are telling about their plans for martial law. They know if the economy drops, we're going to see mass rioting and, as Ellen White says, scenes throughout the whole world like the French Revolution. That's what's ahead. We just don't know when. But as Adventists, as Ellen White said even to the Pharisees, you know, we can see the seasons, we can see all the signs, we surely can deduce that these things are coming. And the economy. You know, I've got money in the bank and I want it to last as long as I live. So I'm not really wanting calamity for myself or anyone else. But just looked at logically, in 2008, the world economy broke. At one point, there was 60%, I was amazed at this figure, and I investigated, it was true. 60% of the merchant ships in the whole world were sitting at anchor in 2008. The system broke, and it's not been fixed. And all the economists that I listen to, they differ a bit on when it'll happen and what, but they're clustering around about 2 years from now. They expect the second phase of that. Because the reality is, the money we have is just a piece of paper and numbers. It's only money because you think it's money. The government says it's money. And even within the norms of paper money, the US is breaking the rules, right, left, and centre. It only gets away with it, well, not only, but the main reason it gets away with it is because we are a dominant world power. And since World War II, by agreement with all the major nations, the dollar is the exchange currency for commodities, oil and raw materials and international trade. So there's sort of a need for it to be stable. But Saddam Hussein unsettled it by specifying that the oil, under the oil for food, had to be paid in euros. Gaddafi unsettled it by planning with African nations to have a gold-based African currency. Both gone, aren't they? Russia is working currently now with China and a couple of other countries to have a basket currency of their currencies that will function instead of the dollar. The US is desperate to maintain its hold on as being the essential currency. If it's not, we will bear the fruit. It's just a mathematical certainty. Like in the last couple of years, $3 trillion, we're just sort of, it's hard to describe because we didn't even print the money. I heard a guy from the Federal Reserve talking about it once on TV, and they asked him to explain quantitative easing, and he says, well, I do it. And he says that I don't really understand it. He says it's sort of like magic. You sit it at a computer and they type in numbers, and what they were doing was recapitalizing the banks. They just typed $3 trillion into the bottom line of the banks. But I mean, that's numbers. It doesn't mean anything. And remember what Revelation says. In 1 hour, the merchants of the world are weeping and wailing at this great system collapsing. Their wealth is gone. Whether the US fully qualifies as full, that whole system, I don't know. But it's the type of thing, and it's happened before in the Western economies, when stocks and bonds were first put out in France. They had a horrible experience. You can clearly have a situation where great wealth just vanishes. Nothing. The US is never going to disappear. I mean, it's one thing to have prophecy, but when you're talking about this, of course the US will survive if the economy collapses. But it won't survive as it now is. We've seen it in Eastern Europe and other countries. You have a total collapse of the monetary system. People lose all of their cash money. Property they usually retain, but I don't really know how a mortgage survives. But it means you drop about 4 levels on standard of living. There is mass poverty. There's usually some sort of violence, and then the government is almost forced to come in and create a strong control. So, this is clearly the type of thing that's coming. Ellen White spoke about it. I often mentioned it in Promoting Liberty magazine. She says that Adventists, that members that fail to give of their means when they have plenty of money will one day throw it at the church, but it'll be worthless. So, she was a prophet, but I don't think you need to be a prophet to say such things. It's just logical. We're at a aberrant time in history. And in fact, I know US history well enough. We've gone through periods where it became almost worthless. The War of Independence was funded on speculation. They gave the what do they call it? It's a common name, and I'm forgetting it. They gave the veterans who'd fought in the War of Independence their pay as a coupon. I forget what it was worth, but for the salary for the time they fought, and the economy collapsed so badly that they were giving it away for a drink at the corner shop type stuff. Nothing. And George Washington told the veterans, hang on to this, it will be worth something at some point. And I'm not sure it was ever quite true, but the economy collapsed. It just zeroed itself out and then rebuilt again. So, it's not so much trying to prove whether or not that will happen. This happens over and over in history. But when we're talking the final events that Adventists expect, clearly such a major dip which has precedent, when it happens in our situation, will precipitate and empower these forces that we can describe that are wanting to re-Christianize or to have a Christian republic and Sunday law and so on. And Sunday law is, Adventists are fixated on it. It's important for a number of reasons, but obviously any religious group through the ages that have wanted government support for their religion, first thing they come at is gathering together in the church. So Sunday just naturally comes to the fore, but it doesn't stop there. It has all sorts of aberrations, some of which still sit in the Sunday law or the blue law books, where you can be punished civilly, sometimes severely, for speaking badly of religion, for blasphemy laws and so on. Many states have those sort of things. Early Adventists, when the Adventist church was first formed, there were only about 15,000 of them in the early days, and of that group, as many as 900 were severely fined or imprisoned for breaking the blue laws. And we've even got an old photograph in the GC vaults of Adventists on the chain gang down south for working on Sunday. So it's not so extraordinary to even get back to that point again, which we would find very onerous, but it could get much worse. We're in a time of overpopulation, of limited resources. People are not living on the land anymore. So extraordinary things are done when there's a crisis. It's just logical. You don't have to have a persecution complex. Think about Europe in World War II. I'm still impressed going to, not Geneva, what's the other main city in Switzerland?
Zurich?
Yeah, Zurich. Going to Zurich, and in the center of town, their big public park, they still have it divided up into little garden blocks. I'd say each block was maybe about 40 feet by about 20 feet, not much bigger than that. And everyone has a little plot that's been allocated to them. Well, in World War II, that's how people survived in some of those places. They had their little plot. But that's not so anymore. Certainly in our country, people are not used to growing. They don't have space. They're in apartments and all the rest. And Ellen White speaks to this. She says, they will come and take what you have when this time of trouble comes. I can go on and on this, but I've read the Patriot Act, and in the Patriot Act and in the Homeland Security regulations, it says specifically, your private garden is to be taken. It's public property. Most people don't understand this. It's already decided. In an emergency, it's not yours. These are not things to be afraid of in themselves, but we shouldn't coddle ourselves that a nice, liberal, open system will survive an extreme emergency. I came into this job, and he remembers it, quoting on the British system. They have the War Powers Act. Everything gets suspended. And extraordinary things were done in England and in Australia under the excuse of an emergency, even though it was a democratic representative system. It's the same here.
Just look at the example of 911. The
Well,
You got severe economic,
the Bible says, give their minds over to a strong delusion.
severe economic, and we all
Yeah.
know, and this is coming from outside, so not just the Adventists. I'm talking to friends where I teach that are clearly stating, and they're not Christian, at least they're not so professed in front of me that way, but they clearly are indicating that this severe economic downturn
Right.
in a year or two.
Yeah.
They're all saying it. And what affects us the most is the dollar. We don't realize how much we depend on our financial security. If that goes overnight, you're going to see the true character of individuals come out.
Yeah.
You're going to see the true personality come out of every individual at that point. And if we haven't cultivated, as you said this morning, cultivated a character in Christ, it's not like it's going to turn on like that.
Right. Good. Very, very good point.
That's where we have to do it now. We have to learn. We have to study.
Right.
We have to do all
And there's a good side to this because it's not long ago, I remember I got a call from I got to be careful. I'm not feeling older. I'm older than I ever thought I'd be. But I talk about old people and I realize they might not be any much older than me, if at all. But I got a call from an elderly lady. She sounded elderly on the phone. But she said an Adventist evangelist had come and, revved them all up and said that they should leave for the country. And she's a single lady. I guess her husband had died. And she says, should I move? He's saying I should sell my property, move to the country. And I said, well, if you do that now, that will be your time of trouble. She never lived in the country. She didn't know what she was doing. Because the electronics that we've got, surveillance, means there's really no hiding place if you're wanted. What Ellen White said, or gave advice on, was that we should be out of the line of fire. And I think to live downtown in a big city is asking for trouble. When there's riots and dislocations, that's sort of the locus of it. But I think just to be on the fringes is about as safe as you can get now. When a Sunday law with a death penalty comes, you run for your life. But beyond that, just to be out of the line of fire is the best you can do. But your protection is not of your own making. It's God promised when the crisis comes, if you're faithful, you will be protected, not in a blanket protection because people will die. But, God will intervene, and especially after the close of probation. Angels, I remember there was a big fuss in Adventism. The idea that we would have to stand without a mediator in the time of trouble freaked people out. There's no need for a mediator. That's when God specially helps you. You're confirmed. So the world is headed for trouble, and it's probably not going to be easy for anybody. But it'll be much worse for the wicked. Remember David, in one of his Psalms, he says, he spoke about things were going bad for him and all the rest. He says, but when I went into the sanctuary, I saw that truly there that the wicked are really going to get it, and there's security for me. And that's the case, It'll be a testing time, but it's much worse for the wicked, much worse for those that aren't depending on God. So we shouldn't have fear. We should just have sober preparation and prepare ourselves to trust the Lord. And it's hard for everyone. I don't think it comes naturally. But my mother said years ago, and her voice rings even though she's gone for years, she says, Adventists love religious liberty because it scares them. And at a certain level, yes, but if it's just a fear thing, it's not good. Remember, the Bible says perfect love casts out fear. So if we're, as A.T. Jones kept saying, if our lives are hid with Christ, if we've died to self, nobody can touch you then. You're already spiritually in another world. But he said, if all you've got is this world, he says, and they threaten to take away your property, your family, your life. He says, nobody much can withstand that. I think he had a good point.
You mentioned about basically there's no place to hide anymore. I have an app on my phone that has divided this entire planet up into 3-foot squares. So they can locate me or anybody within 3 feet anywhere on planet Earth.
Yeah.
So
And the satellites now have radar that can see through the roof of a house. Now, they're not doing it to everyone at all times, but if they really want you, there's no hiding place. And I've told groups before, it was amazing to me, I never thought about it before. an Adventist that works down in Washington I wish I could remember what he called the organization, but basically the computer center for the federal government. He came twice to my office, very intense, and he says, you have no idea. He says, they know who are Adventists. He says, because it's not whether your book name is on the book, since they're tracking everything. The government has decided to track everything electronic, everything. They've got massive servers that are just dumping everything into it, and as yet they haven't figured out how to process all of it, but that's the design. And he says, if everything's going in, like your car has a GPS on it, not the one you use, there's a GPS, it's embedded in the engine, it's always giving away its location. Your phone is giving it away. When your phone's switched on, the camera is picking up both the sound of anyone nearby, so you could be picked up speaking because you walk past someone with a phone and they'll do a voice print, they know that's you. There's just 1,000 ways they're triangulating your credit card operation, all of that. He says, an Adventist stands out like a sore thumb. There's a pattern of behavior, of purchases and travel and all the rest on the Sabbath. So they know exactly who you are. Just press a button, just the parameters, all the Adventists are identified. Well, that's good. So you're known by your practice of Adventism, not whether your name is on the book.
This is where we.
I'm sorry.
Leave it in the end. That's what I'm saying. We now know this stuff that they're capable of tracking you no matter where
Yeah.
you are.
And it's not malicious,
No,
but it can easily be used maliciously.
exactly
You-
at this point, no.
You can't sort of fight against it. We're not Luddites because, people used to break the looms in industrial England thinking they could hold back progress. It's there, like it or not. But there's in any big city, there are thousands of cameras, anyone does something, remember on the news within days or within hours, they've got a picture of them committing the crime and not too clear picture, but they'll figure it out sooner or later.
And that's where our faith, that's where our true faith in Christ comes in.
Right.
We have to totally rely on Him.
Yeah.
Because we know that the technology is there to find us.
So if I had to leave a message on all of this, I think we need to decide now how we're going to relate to the stress when it will come, and be at least comfortable with the idea that things like the Sunday law are proceeding. It's not something that no sign of it couldn't happen now. It's well on its way, and while no one knows when it happened, but we know the types of catalysts or catalysts that would produce it. And there's no shortage of such things: economic collapse, ecological disasters,
Natural disasters.
with our president. I hope not, but we're in a very funny stage with North Korea. He's been gulled along, and now he's likely in reaction to start calling him Mr. Rocket Man again. And the Asians don't like to be shamed in public, so it's not impossible, I hope not, that they'll lob something to California or somewhere, a kamikaze run. The world will not be the same if they do something like that. I mean, they clearly can't beat the US, but nuclear weapons are a Damocles sword that I've lived through my whole life. But it's illogical to think between now and the end of time they'll not be used. Of course they will. Every single weapon that man's had, and some of them have been thoroughly unthinkable, have been used to their fullest extent before it was over. I read a wonderful book years ago called The Doomsday Men, about all the developers of mass weapons and unthinkable weapons. And they all share a sort of a mentality that they're going to save bloodshed, and they all inevitably do their worst, and it goes to the limit.
There's a lot of Bible verses. One, God talking about God being our hiding place.
Right.
Another one talking being our shelter in the time of trouble.
Right.
Just numerous ones.
Yeah. So we need to keep those promises.
It's like
And-
I'm thinking of a vision or a dream that Ellen White had where she saw people in small groups together, like in caves and stuff like that. Not necessarily caves like we think of today, but places that are provided at the time that God leads them to.
Right.
Gives to them. They're like sheltered by this. And it's like, it doesn't matter, almost in a sense, it doesn't matter that there are all of these methods put in place to be able to track and to know exactly where everybody is.
Right.
They're going to be useless to them because God's going to be
Right.
the same.
Yeah, when God decides to intervene, of course. And I've read Great Controversy over the years a few times, and I early on got the distinct impression from her descriptions that at least in the real time of trouble, central government seems to have broken down. It's a very Gothic sort of a scenario, which is exactly what you'd get if there was some sort of a nuclear disruption. And then the other thing she says on a number of occasions about balls of fire falling on the coastal cities and the great houses disintegrating in a moment. Don't know, but you have to expect the worst, because the whole point of it, again back to Milton, God's allowing Satan to do his worst so that God can do his best, but it has to play itself out.
And his protection, like I was just commenting on, it's like poured out on those who have been faithful to him. Yeah. Even at the cost of their own life. Yeah, and
it's a good time to reiterate what I've picked up from Jones. I think he was right on the money. They were wrong about the timing, although maybe not, because it could have happened then. The end of time, Ellen White says, no time prophecy after 1844. And I don't think, at least based on even what she says, that the time was meant to go this long. God could have ended it if the dynamic had been different, because God doesn't control everything. You need to understand that. He's omnipotent, but given that he allows autonomy to his creation, we're part of the dynamic. He's not directing it. He can influence it if we allow him. So the time it goes backwards and forwards. It could have come before, and it can delay. But I think A.T. Jones had it straight. This thing was in line, but the precursor to that has to be people that are prepared. There has to be a spiritual preparation. And that's what's more and more worrying me. Obviously myself, we all have to deal with that. But since I'm talking about religious liberty, I don't think Adventists are ready. Not in the US, not in Australia, not in England, not in the Western countries at least. And I have opinions on some of the other countries, but I know we're not in the West.
Oh, thanks. I have a question. When the papacy reaches across to Protestant leaders, which you indicated there's clear
Well, they've pretty much done that.
That's done, or is being done. What is our church doing? Are they
Here's where it gets tricky.
invited into the discussion, or do we not? Do we just respectfully
Well, our public affairs and religious liberty, it's a bit bigger than a religious liberty department. Public affairs, it has a mandate to dialogue with governments, civil authorities, and other religious institutions. So it shouldn't be necessarily wrong to even talk to Catholics. They're good. Many of them are very good Christians, and even if the organisation is as corrupt as Protestants used to say, there's still some value in talking to them. You clarify a situation. That is not seditious. There's always a danger that our church has seen of going cap in hand to the papacy and perhaps warm embraces and cuddly moments. That doesn't go the right direction. My father was working at the GC years and years ago, so I used to get reports at home about what was happening on dealing with the Pope and so on. And we've had people decades and decades ago that were not as sensitive about how things looked and liked to get buddy-buddy with the Rome. But that's a personal thing. Our church has never tried to join the World Council of Churches. We've never been even slightly tempted to sign any compact with Rome or anything. So in that regard, we've never compromised. And I don't think we're about to. But where I think the compromise will be, in fact, I'll be a prophet on this. I'm positive that when a Sunday law comes, you will find some elements, even of our church, that will probably in different magazines and that say that, why I could see the headline, worship important, say. And they'll say, we're in light of the present emergency our country's under, While we recognize Sabbath as the only day for us to worship, given that our country needs to seek God and there's a request that we meet on Sunday and so on, that we would encourage our members not to thwart. And Ellen White herself says that nothing wrong with worshipping on Sunday as well as Sabbath, as long as you just, well, not so much worship, do nature walks and all the rest, but there's a thin line in that between compromise and recommending. And I'm positive there's going to be some weaselly statements from some leaders. And the reason I think so is because it's always happened in the past. In the communist countries, that's exactly what happened. And a few other dictatorships in Africa and Asia. So you've got to know what you believe and stick with it. But now our church, I don't know why you're asking the question, but I know there's stuff online at the moment that's embarrassing, and our top leadership are also embarrassed to see those pictures. But we need to be careful. But but there's been a shift. When I was a kid, the Catholic Church was starting to rise again from the ashes, and their effort then was clearly to heal the break of the Reformation and to sort of have a single reconstituted world Roman Catholic Church. I don't think they're quite seeing it that way anymore. Now they're more than content for the Pope to be the chairman of the board. But that said, I made comments about Martin Luther this morning. The Lutheran Church have essentially rejoined Rome. They had a document, I forget the year, I think 96, thereabouts. They had signed a document with Rome, at least the main Lutheran Federation. There's several breakaways. Signed an agreement with Rome saying that it was a doctrinal misunderstanding between the Church and Luther. And then just a couple of years ago, they came out with a second document saying there is no longer any impediment to full union. So Lutheranism's gone. The Church of England, still the Church of England, but they've pretty much made their peace with Rome, and Rome even allows Church of England ministers to hold positions in the Roman Catholic Church because they're married priests, but they can hold an ordinariate. So effectively they've joined, but not organizationally, just a coalition. And I think that's what Rome's after. And I remember joking with John Gratz a few years ago when he went to Rome, and their contact at the time was Cardinal Caspar in Rome. And they would have nice meetings with him, and from their point of view, sharing what Adventist concerns were on religious liberty and elsewhere. And I went online and I saw Caspar's report to the Holy See. And he said there that ecumenical moves with the Adventist Church were proceeding very well, right on schedule. I like to think they weren't, but that's how Rome sees it. But they've changed their model, I'm certain. And to me, the singular event of recent years was, time gets by, I guess it's nearly 4 years ago, 3.5 or so years ago now, when the Pope came to Rome, and came to Washington rather, and spoke before a joint session of Congress. To me, that was just like, you couldn't get a louder or more emphatic fulfillment of prophecy. And from every level, just from a point of history, this was never a Christian nation, but it was until fairly recently, and I forget the demographics, but it still might even be, a dominant Protestant society. And at different times in American history, it's been very vigorously anti-Catholic, which wasn't a good thing, but violently. When the Catholic immigrants came, especially with the Irish potato famine, there were riots and murders and all sorts of stuff against Catholics. The Ku Klux Klan, that people remember only usually for their racist violence, but they were a bit broader than that. The Ku Klux Klan were wanting a white Christian America, a white Protestant America, and they persecuted also Jews and Catholics big time. So, these were markers of the past when Protestantism was something people would fight and harm others for. That's gone. And the Pope came like a conquering hero. only religious leader ever to speak to Congress. And he didn't just speak to them, he lectured them. And he's heard me give this talk before. I hate to repeat in front of people. But to me, it's amazing to hear the Pope lecturing them about the ecology and ecological norms and how the capitalist system is abusive to people all over the world. But he started his speech, actually his whole speech was premised around 4 individuals, 2 Catholics, a Catholic priest and a nun. The nun was a socialist, and the priest an Eastern mystic. So he was incorporating some crazy elements into religion. And then 2 secular Americans. There was Martin Luther King, very natural because he's talking about liberty and so on. But his first figure was Abraham Lincoln. And I couldn't believe the Pope launching off with that. And it wasn't spontaneous because it was linked into the logic of his speech, and he looked and picked up on a painting or a statue of Abraham Lincoln and then moved on. And I've learned that Rome they think everything through in great detail. And let me ask a question. I love history. Anybody want to give a 2 or 3 sentence explanation for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln?
Jesuits?
Oh, you know too much. No. So what? Tell me the story. Most people... well, go ahead.
I've actually watched some documentaries about them, several things about them. And, after they had the Reformation, a lot of people know about the Reformation, and they should, absolutely. But I think people also need to be educated about the counter-Reformation, what was opposed to the Reformation. So, and basically that was the creation, or in some cases, perhaps a reformation of the Jesuits. And they basically turned from something that they were, and then they formed into a more organized system called the Jesuits. They were basically, they were essentially papal assassins that were said to
yeah.
destroy Protestants.
Ignatius Loyola founded the order. He was an ex-soldier, and the whole design was they were to be literal soldiers for the papacy, to do whatever it took. And in the early days, it was a lot of violence. So there's a Jesuit connection. Most people think, because they get it from the history books, so certainly in the high schools, is about all they have in there is that John Wilkes Booth, a frustrated artist and somewhat Southern sympathizer, killed him and yelled out, so perish tyrants, and that was it. They got him, and that was the end of it. If you read some chick publications and some internal stuff within Protestants, you might get some of the story, but you don't need to go there. In the standard full-size history books that they're not given out to the grade school kids, the story's all there, including photographs. There were 11 conspirators, all Roman Catholic except one who was in the process of being converted to Catholicism. There were Jesuit priests involved. It was a broad-based conspiracy to decapitate the US government. It wasn't just an assassination. That same night, one of the conspirators stabbed Secretary Seward many times and left him for dead, but he survived. Another conspirator was to kill Vice President Johnson, but it misfired. And another was to kill General Grant, and that misfired. But if they'd succeeded on all fronts, there'd have been a decapitated government. And it all happened in the context of the Pope ranting and railing against Lincoln and the Northern cause. The only real Southern sympathizer and spy in the whole group was out of town when it happened, so he lit out. It was Mary Surratt. It was the owner of a public house where the conspiracy took place, and her brother was the spy. And he lit out for Canada, was sheltered there by Jesuit priests, and then made his way to Rome, and he became a member of the Pope's bodyguard. I mean, you couldn't make it up if you tried. And they arrested most of them at the time, and I think 6 of them were hanged. And there's Matthew Brady pictures of the hanging, first woman ever hanged in this country. So it's no secret. So to me, the Pope granted a privilege that historically would never have been given to any religious leader, let alone a pope, for him to be in front of Congress, and he leads off with Abraham Lincoln. That is rude, rude, rude. And what I think he was doing was wave it and see if they notice. And to me, it fits perfectly in with Senator Santorum's comment. Good guy, but a Catholic indicator of what Catholics think. For him to say publicly, Protestantism is absent in America today. That's what the Catholics think, and I think they were testing it. And that's ultimately what I think the greatest threat to civil and religious liberties in the United States. A lot of the fellow religious liberty people that I deal with, they're all hung up on legal cases and all the rest. They're not unimportant, but I think they miss, historically, it's changed attitudes, it's sea changes in how a society look at things and external events and the results they produce. That laws can be fine, and suddenly it's all short-circuited. And if we forget, first of all, our Protestantism, if we forget our Constitution, our history, we're sitting ducks in the US for all sorts of alarms and disturbances. And again, I don't vote, but I'm not really opposed or pro Trump, but I think there's illustration exhibit A. When people are absent without leave, what happens? I think even the supporters of Trump know this is a very aberrant time for America, and we're simultaneously denying certain better attributes of the U.S. and yet going back to, as Abraham Lincoln said, the worst angels of our nature. I don't know how much longer you want to go, but any more questions? Nobody has a question? I always feel guilty. I don't major in it, but accommodation. Charles usually can really fill you in on procedures and so on.
So we're concerned, what do we do?
Well, we can't do a lot as far as these big events, but I do think Adventists need to be aware, because if we're not aware of the overall dynamic and both prophecy and history and the meaning of events, we'll be easily deceived and at the very least placed in positions of compromise that if we knew differently, we wouldn't sort of put our head in the noose. As far as some of these actual pieces of legislation, I don't know if Charles wants to talk about it, but Adventists can write letters to the editor. Adventists can contact your local representative and make it clear what you think about some legislative initiative that might be prejudicial toward religious liberty in general, or maybe for Adventists in particular.
So how do we learn about legislative opinions?
You want to? I mean, even on public radio, Nina Totenberg, I found her very. You listen to her much?
I've heard her, yeah.
She often brings up things that bear on religious liberty. I've been surprised. So if you just, I don't know what it is, but I get the distinct impression that we Adventists in the main, and I'm not talking about any of you in the particular, but Adventists in the main are not very well informed. And we obviously should read the Bible and Ellen White even more, but I don't think we're using much of our time for any of it. But we should at least take the time to be up to speed on what's happening in the world around us.
We should read Liberty Magazine.
Right, that's a good start. I mean, it's only 32 pages, but it'll certainly get you started.
So we can go to the website?
You can. It doesn't say it very loudly, but there is a tax. If you go to the website, you're under moral obligation to send a sub to somebody else. I mean, you can get it free, but we can't stay in existence without producing an actual magazine that we get put in front of legislators and those people, because that's never going to substitute. I mean, a website's never going to substitute for placing it in front of a target.
I wasn't talking about liberty as a new paragraph. We want to know what legislation is up for consideration. So if it's state legislation, we go to the Massachusetts.gov or .gov, Massachusetts,
Yeah.
whatever. And then we go to the Congress area, and then we see what legislation is.
That's one that would be very helpful.
Same on the federal level.
But I think you need a bit more than that to need to just follow in the news, because there's an awful lot of legislation that really doesn't mean anything. It might be on the agenda, but there's legislators that will put things on the agenda knowing ahead of time it's going nowhere, but they're satisfying some supporters or trying to make a point. So if you react thinking that everything that's coming up is a present danger or a true reality, you could be sort of panicked a lot. It's sort of obvious now that the worst case, a national Sunday law wouldn't pass today. It couldn't. I don't think the climate would allow it, but you might find something that's hinting at that. There's a lot of proposals. If something is passed through their committees and put on the agenda, then it's a bit more serious. But even some of those are just testing the waters. But there's an awful lot of legislative proposals that go into committee that are never going to amount to anything. But if you know why they're put in there by reading more about the dynamic and the public discussions and agendas of different groups, then it makes more sense. I just think never hurts to be generally aware of stuff. And I pick it up over and over. I do not think Adventists are as a group, particularly aware of things around them.
So I work in a setting where we're grant funded and we teach English as a second language. So we get emails sometimes, we think the funding is going to be taken away. So they will send us specifically and explain in simple language, and we'll call as instructors to get more funding.
Yeah.
Call our representatives. Is there any site like that we can go to? Or do we want to be colonists? Do we want to put up the word something? Should we let things just happen? Or what?
No. Ellen White says, many say that these things are going to happen anyway, so they fold their hands and say, we should do all in our, and I'm paraphrasing, we should do all in our power to hold back the evil. And why? Again, Adventists don't always think through. There's only one good reason why we should want it delayed, so that the time can be used to tell other people about our mess. If it's just to give us a little more time of security, God's never going to answer such a need.
I'm a simple person. I speak, I teach English as a language. I speak basic to help them learn. I go to read your magazine, and I just can't get excited about it. But I want to.
I'm sorry.
I'm interested in the topics. But
Yeah. Do you read my editorials? At least you should get excited about that.
there's something simple that we can read where we can, if there's something serious that we can call on.
Well, there is no liberty from an Adventist perspective is about it, and I've tried to simplify it. It used to be a bit more complicated. I know we had a lot more legal sort of articles, and they were even longer. I've tried to shorten them. We have 2-page articles regularly, never usually longer than 3 or 4.
I haven't read recently, so I don't
Yeah. But, by nature, it's the sort of topic that requires at least sort of concentration. I mean, the simple stuff is what you alluded to. Many special interest groups in the religious right particularly, or the right-wing political faction generally, they're always sending out fundraisers and rabble-rousing that this is about to happen, and they're usually not so much inaccurate but misleading. They try to rev people up so they give, so they overstate it badly. Yeah. Well, read Liberty, that's a good start. And you might even get some cues as to who's writing or what groups are mentioned and check on. One of the biggest debates that I had of recent years with one of our Adventist lawyers at one of these afternoon meetings. He violently objected to me saying that the Becket Fund is a front for Roman Catholicism. But it is. So again, the Becket Fund are involved in a lot of very good things in defending religious liberty. But if you just know that one thing, you'll see the subtext on a lot of things. They're working for Roman Catholic interests by and large, which sometimes helps us. But you have to know sort of the subtext of a lot of stuff. And I'm hoping to go again to the dinner. I went to their dinner a couple of years ago now, and the guest speaker, all the cardinals were there from the US, and it was sort of like the down-home week for Roman Catholic leadership. all their high-powered lawyers, and the guest speaker was one of the 12 apostles of the Mormons. But I had to figure his message is what they were wanting. And he said unambiguously, I couldn't believe it, he says, there's way too much talk in the United States of individual civil and religious rights, and not enough talk of the corporate rights of the church. And that just, my blood ran cold when I heard that. That's the thinking of the medieval church. And that's what Catholicism is pushing at the moment. So, you pick up on that sort of stuff, and you can get some of it in Liberty. You can sort of see the lay of the land. And I do think the day is not far off where freelance spirituality will be discouraged in the US. Seems odd, but we're getting away from the individual rights more to vested interest. And I don't know if Charles agrees with me, but I was very bothered when the Supreme Court brought out the Citizens United case, where they said that corporations have the rights of individuals. To me, that plays into the same dynamic on two levels. It plays into the Rome being treated as a power base and a privileged point for conscience rather than the individual. And it also plays into the loss of individual civil liberties going back to the beginning of the US. The US was begun with a corporate mindset, the slave owner owning property, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These were all corporate endeavors. I remember once the greatest gift, well, my father gave me a few gifts, but one of the gifts he gave me of sort of comprehension, I remember we were talking once about the US, and he says, just remember, this is a capitalist country. Once you understand capitalism, not that it's inherently wrong, but capitalism run amok is very dangerous, certainly in its extreme form. But capitalism explains just 99% of what goes on in this country. Just the other day, I looked at something that a few people here might remember, or at least closer to the occasion. But I just looked again at or President Eisenhower, his farewell speech. If you haven't seen that, go look at it. It'll make your blood run cold. It's amazing. Every time I see it, I think, man, the guts that it took of an outgoing president on a TV broadcast before the nation, he tells them to beware of the military-industrial complex. In other words, big business is taking over this country. And he didn't mince any words. And if that was a problem then, where are we now? And I've got to be careful. I'm not an ex-veteran. The closest I come is I came from Australia as a teenager in the middle of the Vietnam War. And it bothered me in Australia that I would have been drafted because they were the top ally of America. When I arrived in the US, I had to register for the draft. And the number was 243. And I never went because my grades were good, plus my number was high. And the society mistreated the Vietnam veterans, there's no question. So that I have opinions on. But it really bothers me today. We're becoming a militaristic society. And, this idea that we're constantly thanking the veterans for their service. On the plane, we all stand aside and doff our hats and all the rest as they go on. And I know that these are young kids from Flint, Michigan and other places. They can't get a job. Like other third world countries, my wife's from Guatemala, little Indians out of the town that know nothing, they draft them in, officers are more educated, and they're kids that'll do anything they're told to do. We're drifting into the same thing with the mercenary army, and for us to bow and scrape before them, it's corrupting to society. I remember once we were lined up, and I said to someone, as all these military guys go in before, I said, we might as well be in Berlin in 1936. It's exactly the same. And then the other day, on my last flight, I said to someone, to the lady checking the tickets, and I said, because she said, oh no, where was it? Was buying something, and she said, are you military? And I said, I could be if it's a discount, but I said, this is like under the communists. I said, the nomenclatura, the military and the leadership were a privileged class, and we were against communism. It was horrible class consciousness and the dictatorship of the empowered class. We don't want to get that way. In my view, we should be thankful that we have, in a civil sense, people that are willing to defend the country. They're not to be despised, but it's a necessary evil. And to me, it should be a little bit like in the medieval times, the public executioner. You didn't know who he was. It was a necessary thing, but he didn't brag about it. He put a thing over his head because it was not something to be proud of, that you're a killer. And the post-traumatic stress syndrome that these kids are facing is because they're doing unthinkable things. And I've got two kids, one's a teenager and one's just moved out. And I know, and not that I've done everything right, but when they've done something wrong, to then clap them on the back and say, wonderful, good job, that creates an internal conflict like you wouldn't believe. I don't think it's good. It's toxic for our society to be lauding and honouring people that are indulged in optional wars of preemption and protecting oil and all the rest, and they've done things that no right-thinking person would be easy with. Not good. So, we're in a very toxic environment. I believe these are all signs that the Lord is coming soon. And, I gave a sermon the last few weeks on Christian soldiers. We've got to enlist in the right army and not put our faith in the M15s or whatever it is they use now, or the peacemakers they used to call the missiles. We're clearly in a time of the degradation of language. I mean, I grew up reading 1984. So far in the back, it was a prophetic year in its ancient history. But in that book, a very far-seeing author, he spoke of a time when language was subverted to mean the direct opposite. And we're into that. Just be careful. People can say one thing and they mean the opposite. And not to mention, I love history, and I'm fascinated by other people, World War II and the whole Nazi stuff. But it scares me, Homeland Security and all these World War II-like images. We should be careful. I think not that we should be opposed to this. We should realize that the net of end-time structure is just forming around us as we speak. And I'll end on this, unless someone's got a burden on a question. Remember the dynamic of group thinking. I've been to the communist countries, I've been to a few dictator places, and unless they're in the middle of a civil war, or unless someone is a direct antagonist of the government or being persecuted, any country you go to, it doesn't matter what system they have, in their group discussion, they all say, we live in the freest, greatest country in the world. They all say that. That's groupthink. So, and I'm not denigrating America. I think this has been a beacon for the world for a long, long time. Not always by practice, but by aspiration. But just because everybody says this is a free country doesn't make it so. And just think of one thing, I'll leave it with you. You know that already now you're a bit careful what you say on the phone. So think that large. We've already crossed the line where it's not quite what we imagine. And the end of time will be far worse, I think. Far more controlling and not the freedom that we were once used to. But regardless of what it is, even if we were to ever live in something like North Korea, we're still to live before God the same way. But after a time, you sort of break free of your naive sort of faith in the civil system to be your savior. It never was the way we thought it was, and even less in the future. Our faith needs to be in God. Well, thank you very much for coming and for asking questions. Thank you. God bless you.
We want to thank Elder Steed for joining us this weekend, and let's have a closing prayer. Dear Father, thank you so much that you have brought us this information, for bringing Elder Steed here safely, and for the wisdom you've given us through him, through his words. We pray that we will be aware of these things that are coming upon us, that will not catch us by surprise, and that we will be ready and fit to meet Jesus and see him face to face. Please help us to stand through these final days, and please give Elder Steed safety as he travels around talking about these things to educate your people. In Jesus' name, amen.